The ghostly dance of the aurora borealis painted the Alaskan sky in ethereal shades of green and purple, but Sarah Mitchell barely noticed the cold numbing her fingertips as she adjusted her camera settings. This shot would be worth it. It had to be, the same way her daughter's last words had to be worth it. Maybe if you spent less time chasing perfect pictures and more time being present, you and Dad would still be together. The words echoed in her mind, sharp as the wind cutting through her thermal layers. Her breath clouded in the frigid air as she checked the exposure again. At 35, Sarah had thought she had it all figured out, a successful career in wildlife photography, a family that understood her passion, a life that made sense. Now, standing alone on this remote ridge, she wondered if she'd been framing everything wrong all along. The first snowflake landed on her lens, an unwelcome intruder in her perfect composition. Sarah brushed it away, but another followed. Then another. She glanced up from her viewfinder, and her stomach dropped. The storm she'd been tracking had arrived hours ahead of schedule, a wall of white bearing down on her position with frightening speed. Sarah scrambled to pack her equipment, her fingers clumsy with cold. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a hungry beast. She needed shelter, and she needed it now. The cabin she passed 2 miles back was her best chance, but as the snow began falling in earnest, the familiar trail markers became harder to spot. "Stay calm," she muttered to herself, shouldering her heavy camera bag. "Just follow your tracks back." But her boot prints were already disappearing under fresh powder, and the dimming light made every tree look identical. The temperature was plummeting, and Sarah knew the statistics, how quickly hypothermia could set in, how many experienced hikers died each year in conditions exactly like these. She pulled out her phone. No signal, of course. The GPS was working, but the screen was nearly impossible to read through the thickening snow. Sarah forced herself to keep moving, each step more uncertain than the last. The wind drove ice crystals into her face like tiny needles, and the world around her became a swirling white void. 10 minutes became 20, then an hour. Sarah's confidence wavered with each step. Nothing looked familiar anymore. The cabin should have been visible by now, but all she could see was white. Her legs burned from trudging through the deepening snow, and her thoughts started to scatter like leaves in the wind. The ground beneath her feet suddenly shifted. Sarah's heart lurched as she felt, rather than saw, the hidden drop-off. She threw herself backward, but it was too late. The snow-covered edge crumbled, and she plunged into darkness. The world spun, a chaos of snow and sky, before something hard slammed into her left leg with a sickening crack. Pain exploded through her body, and a scream tore from her throat, echoing off unseen walls. She'd fallen into some kind of crevasse, a natural trap hidden beneath the snow. Sarah lay there, gasping, afraid to move. Her leg throbbed in time with her racing heart, and when she tried to shift her position, the pain nearly made her black out. "Help," she called, but her voice was lost in the howling wind. "Somebody, please." Only the storm answered, dumping more snow into her prison. Sarah fumbled for her phone with trembling hands, but it must have been lost in the fall. Her camera bag lay just out of reach, probably ruined anyway. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spent her career capturing images of animals fighting for survival, and now here she was, about to become another statistic in nature's unforgiving ledger. What would her daughter think when they found her body? Would she blame herself for their last angry conversation? Would her ex-husband regret not trying harder to make her stay? As darkness began to fall, the cold crept deeper into Sarah's bones. She tried to remember her survival training, stay awake, keep moving, conserve body heat, but the pain in her leg made movement almost impossible, and exhaustion tugged at her consciousness like a heavy blanket. "I'm sorry, Emily," she whispered, thinking of her daughter's face. "I should have been there more." The words disappeared into the growing darkness, carried away by the relentless wind. Sarah's thoughts began to drift, memories mixing with the present like watercolors bleeding together. A sound cut through the storm, something between a growl and a whine. Sarah's head snapped up, her heart pounding. There, at the edge of the crevasse, a massive shape loomed against the fading light. Two amber eyes reflected what little daylight remained, studying her with an intelligence that made her breath catch. A wolf, larger than any she'd ever photographed, its silver-gray coat almost white against the snow. Sarah's mind raced through everything she knew about wolf behavior, but nothing had prepared her for being trapped, injured, and face-to-face with one of nature's most efficient predators. The wolf tilted its head, those haunting eyes never leaving her face. Sarah remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. This was it, she thought. After surviving the fall, she was going to end up as a wolf's dinner. She closed her eyes, unable to watch as the predator made its move. Something soft brushed against her face. "Sarah." Sarah's eyes flew open to find the wolf had somehow made its way down into the crevasse. It stood over her, its breath warm against her frozen skin. But instead of attacking, it pressed its body against hers, sharing its heat. Sarah's mind struggled to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. She must be hallucinating from the cold and pain. Wolves didn't help humans. She'd spent years documenting their behavior, their natural wariness toward people. Yet here was this magnificent creature, deliberately providing warmth to a dying stranger. As consciousness began to slip away, Sarah found herself reaching out with a shaking hand to touch the wolf's thick fur. The last thing she remembered was the steady rhythm of the animal's heartbeat against her side, a drum of life in the growing darkness. Then the world faded to white, and Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had spent her life capturing nature's mysteries, became part of one. A rhythmic thumping pulled Sarah from the depths of unconsciousness. For a moment, she thought it was her own heartbeat, but as awareness slowly returned, she realized the sound came from beside her. The memories rushed back, the storm, the fall, the wolf. Her eyes snapped open, expecting to find herself alone in the crevasse, the encounter nothing more than a dying dream. But the wolf was still there, its massive body curled protectively around her like a living blanket. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. In the dim light filtering through the snow above, she could see the creature more clearly now. Its coat was a stunning mixture of silver and white, and a jagged scar ran along its left flank, a testament to its own battles for survival. This wasn't just any wolf. This was Shadow, the legendary alpha female. She'd spent months trying to photograph the tag in her ear confirmed it. Shadow was practically a celebrity in wildlife circles, known for her unusual size and remarkable intelligence. Sarah had tracked her for weeks last summer, hoping to capture the perfect shot, but the wolf had always remained elusive. Now here she was, pressed against Sarah's side, sharing her body heat through the bitter night. "Why are you helping me?" Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold. Shadow's ear twitched at the sound, and those intelligent amber eyes fixed on Sarah's face. There was something in that gaze that transcended the barrier between species, a depth of understanding that made Sarah's scientific certainties waver. The wolf shifted slightly, and pain shot through Sarah's injured leg, drawing a sharp gasp from her lips. Shadow immediately stilled, as if sensing her distress. The level of awareness in the animal's behavior was extraordinary. Sarah had documented countless wolf interactions over the years, but nothing like this, as if reading her thoughts. Shadow lifted her head and sniffed the air. A low growl rumbled in her chest, but it wasn't threatening. It seemed more like communication. The wolf carefully extracted herself from Sarah's side, and the bitter cold immediately rushed in to fill the void. Sarah wanted to call out to beg the animal not to leave her, but she bit back the words. Shadow was wild, she owed Sarah nothing. To her surprise, the wolf didn't leave the crevasse. Instead, she began pawing at the snow around them, clearing the space and revealing the rocky wall behind. Sarah watched in amazement as Shadow created a small shelter, using her body to pack the snow into a crude wind barrier. The sophistication of the behavior was astounding. This went beyond simple animal instinct. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Sarah murmured, remembering the story she'd heard about Shadow. Rangers had reported finding injured animals that should have died from exposure somehow surviving brutal storms. They had attributed it to luck or exaggeration, but now Sarah wondered if they'd missed something extraordinary. Shadow returned to Sarah's side, this time positioning herself so that her body blocked the worst of the wind. The wolf's fur was damp from her efforts, but her body heat was still a blessed relief from the cold. Sarah found herself studying the animal's face, noting the gray hairs around her muzzle that suggested she was older than initially estimated. "You're a mother, aren't you?" Sarah said softly, remembering the photo she'd seen of Shadow with her pups. Something in the wolf's bearing reminded her of herself, the fierce protectiveness, the weight of responsibility. But unlike Sarah, Shadow had never abandoned her family for her own pursuits. The thoughts sent a fresh wave of pain through her chest, sharper than her physical injuries. Emily's face floated in her mind, her daughter's hurt expression the last time Sarah had missed a school event for a photo assignment. "I chose wrong," she whispered, more to herself than the wolf. "I thought I was following my passion, but I was just running away." Shadow's head turned toward her, those amber eyes seeming to peer into her soul. The wolf made a soft sound, almost like a whimper, and pressed closer. Sarah found herself burying her fingers in the thick fur, drawing comfort from the simple contact. Here, in this frozen crevasse, with a wild predator as her only companion, she felt more understood than she had in years. The storm continued to rage above them, but inside their small shelter, a different kind of weather was breaking. Sarah's tears froze on her cheeks as she finally confronted the truth she'd been avoiding. Her marriage hadn't failed because of her career, it had failed because she'd used that career to hide from her fears of inadequacy, of vulnerability, of the messy, beautiful chaos of real connection. Shadow lifted her head suddenly, ears pricking forward. A low growl vibrated through her chest, but this time it held a note of warning. Sarah strained to hear what had caught the wolf's attention, but all she could make out was the endless howl of the wind. Then she heard it, a distant howl, answered by another, closer. The wolf pack was nearby. Sarah's heart rate spiked. Would Shadow leave her to rejoin her family? The thought of being alone again in the darkness was terrifying, but the alpha female made no move to leave. Instead, she threw her head back and let out a long, complex howl that echoed through the crevasse. The answering calls seemed to fade into the distance. "Did you just tell them to go away?" Sarah asked incredulously. Shadow settled back down, resting her massive head on her paws, those intelligent eyes fixed on Sarah again, and in them, She saw something that defied explanation, a choice being made, a commitment to stay. The realization brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. This wild creature, this mother, this survivor, had chosen to put aside her own needs to help a stranger. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She had spent years trying to capture the essence of wolves in her photographs, but only now, when she was completely helpless, did she truly understand their capacity for compassion. As the night deepened around them, Sarah found herself talking to Shadow, pouring out the story of her broken family, her misplaced priorities, her desperate need to prove herself through her work. The wolf listened with those knowing eyes offering warmth and presence, the very thing Sarah had failed to give her own daughter. The first rays of dawn crept into the crevasse, painting Shadow's fur in hues of gold and silver. Sarah had drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the night, but each time she opened her eyes, the wolf remained steadfast beside her. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness, broken only by their sharp breaths. Sarah's leg had gone from searing pain to a dangerous numbness, and hunger gnawed at her stomach. She hadn't eaten since her trail mix breakfast the day before, and dehydration was becoming a real concern. As if sensing her discomfort, Shadow stirred, rising to her feet with fluid grace. The wolf stretched, shook out her thick coat, and fixed Sarah with an intense stare. "I know," Sarah said weakly. "We can't stay here forever." She tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled with exhaustion, and her injured leg refused to cooperate. Shadow watched her struggle for a moment, then did something remarkable. She lowered her head and pressed it against Sarah's back, providing support as she attempted to sit up. With the wolf's help, Sarah managed to prop herself against the crevasse wall, breathing heavily from the effort. The change in position sent fresh waves of pain through her leg, but it also gave her a better view of their situation. The crevasse wasn't as deep as she'd initially feared, maybe 15 feet, but its walls were steep and slick with ice. Even if her leg hadn't been broken, climbing out would have been nearly impossible. Shadow suddenly tensed, her ears swiveling forward. Before Sarah could wonder what had caught her attention, the wolf bounded up the crevasse wall with impossible agility, disappearing over the edge. "Wait!" Sarah called out, panic rising in her chest. Had Shadow finally abandoned her? The thought of being alone made her heart race, but just as despair began to set in, a sound from above made her look up. Shadow had appeared at the edge of the crevasse, something dark dangling from her mouth. The wolf carefully picked her way back down, and Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized her missing camera bag. "You found it," she exclaimed as Shadow dropped the bag beside her. The wolf sat back, looking almost proud as Sarah frantically dug through the contents. Her spare phone battery was crushed, and the camera was definitely ruined, but her emergency kit was intact, including a small first aid kit, some protein bars, and most importantly, a signal flare. Shadow watched intently as Sarah opened one of the protein bars with shaking hands. The wolf's nose twitched at the smell, and Sarah found herself breaking off half. "Here," she offered, holding it out. "It's not exactly what you're used to, but it's the least I can do." To her amazement, Shadow gently took the offered food, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. As they ate their meager breakfast, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how quickly fear had transformed into trust. Less than 24 hours ago, she would have been terrified to share food with a wild wolf. Now it felt as natural as breathing. But their moment of peace was short-lived. Shadow's head snapped up, her body tensing. A low growl rumbled in her chest, and Sarah heard what had alarmed her, the distant sound of howling much closer than before. The wolf pack was on the move, and they were heading this way. Shadow rose to her feet, pacing the length of their shelter. Her behavior had changed, becoming more agitated. She kept looking between Sarah and the top of the crevasse, as if trying to make a decision. The howls grew closer, and Sarah could hear the desperation in them. They were calling for their alpha. "They need you," Sarah said softly, her heart aching. "It's okay. You've done more than enough." But Shadow didn't leave. Instead, she threw her head back and let out a series of complex howls, different from the ones last night. The answering calls seemed confused, uncertain. What happened next left Sarah breathless. Shadow began gathering loose snow with her paws, packing it against the crevasse wall in a deliberate pattern. She worked methodically, and as Sarah watched, she realized the wolf was creating rough steps, makeshift footholds in the snow and ice. "You're trying to help me get out," Sarah whispered in amazement. The wolf's intelligence was beyond anything she had documented in her years of wildlife photography. This wasn't just instinct or learned behavior. This was problem-solving on a level that challenged everything she thought she knew about wolf cognition. With Shadow's encouragement and support, Sarah began the agonizing process of trying to stand. The wolf positioned herself as a brace, allowing Sarah to lean against her solid frame. Every movement sent spikes of pain through her injured leg, but the alternative was freezing to death in this icy pit. The first attempt to reach the makeshift steps ended in failure, Sarah collapsing back with a cry of pain. Shadow immediately pressed against her, offering warmth and comfort until the worst of the pain subsided. The wolf's patience seemed infinite, her presence a steady anchor in Sarah's world of hurt. "My daughter," Sarah found herself saying as she rested. "She has your eyes, that same golden color. She used to love when I told her stories about the wolves I photographed." Her voice cracked. "I stopped telling her stories when work got busy. I stopped doing a lot of things." Shadow's ears twitched, and she made a soft whining sound that seemed almost sympathetic. The wolf nuzzled Sarah's hand, then stood again, clearly ready for another attempt. Sarah took a deep breath, gathering her courage. The pack's howls were getting closer. They needed to move now. This time, when Sarah reached for the first foothold, Shadow positioned herself differently, using her body as a living platform. The wolf's strength and stability were incredible, and Sarah found herself able to put her weight on her good leg while keeping the injured one free. "We make quite a team," Sarah gasped as she gained the first few inches of height. Shadow's only response was to adjust her position, anticipating Sarah's next move before she made it. The trust between them had become absolute, human and wolf moving as one in a desperate bid for survival. As they began their slow ascent, Sarah realized that Shadow had given her something far more valuable than just physical help. The wolf had shown her what it truly meant to care for another being, to put their needs above your own, to stay when it would be easier to leave, to find solutions where none seemed possible. These were the lessons she needed to take back to Emily if she survived this. These were the truths she had forgotten in her pursuit of the perfect photograph. Sometimes the most important moments weren't the ones you captured through a lens, but the ones that captured your heart instead. The ascent became a brutal dance of pain and determination, each movement a battle against gravity and exhaustion. Shadow moved with incredible precision, adjusting her position whenever Sarah faltered, becoming a living scaffold against the icy wall. The wolf's strength seemed limitless, but Sarah could feel tremors running through the animal's muscles. Shadow was pushing herself to her limits too. Halfway up the crevasse, Sarah's injured leg knocked against an ice outcropping. The pain was explosive, sending black spots dancing across her vision. She nearly lost her grip, a cry of agony echoing off the frozen walls. Shadow immediately pressed closer, taking more of Sarah's weight until she could breathe through the worst of it. "I can't," Sarah gasped, her whole body shaking. "I can't do this." The top of the crevasse seemed impossibly far away, and her strength was failing. The cold had seeped so deeply into her bones that even thinking was becoming difficult. It would be so easy to just let go, to stop fighting against the inevitable. But Shadow wouldn't let her give up. The wolf made a sound unlike anything Sarah had heard before, part growl, part whine, but unmistakably urgent. Those amber eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that cut through her despair. In them, Sarah saw not just determination, but a fierce kind of love that transcended species. "Okay," she whispered, blinking back tears that froze on her cheeks. "Okay, girl, just don't let go." Shadow's ear twitched in response, and they began moving again, one excruciating inch at a time. The wolf pack's howls had grown closer, more insistent. They were searching for their alpha, and Sarah knew Shadow was torn between her duty to them and her chosen task of keeping her alive. The temperature was dropping as evening approached, and the wind had picked up again. Sarah's fingers were so numb she could barely feel the handhold Shadow had helped her create. Each breath felt like swallowing glass, and her injured leg had become a dead weight, useful only for occasionally bracing against the wall. Suddenly, Shadow went rigid, her ears flattened against her head, and a low warning growl rumbled through her chest. "Sarah." Sarah followed the wolf's gaze and felt her heart stop. Another wolf had appeared at the top of the crevasse, its dark gray form silhouetted against the darkening sky. The newcomer was smaller than Shadow but still formidable. It paced the edge, watching them with weary eyes. Shadow's growl deepened, and the other wolf backed away slightly but didn't leave. More shapes appeared at the rim. The entire pack had found them. "They're your family," Sarah said softly, understanding Shadow's conflict. "You need to go to them." But the alpha female didn't move. Instead, she let out a series of short, sharp barks that sent the other wolves retreating from the edge. They didn't go far. Sarah could hear them moving around above, their paws crunching in the snow. The effort to keep them both stable was clearly taking its toll on Shadow. The wolf's breathing had become labored, and Sarah could feel her muscles trembling with fatigue. They were still at least 6 feet from the top, and Sarah's own strength was fading fast. The cold had become a living thing, crushing the air from her lungs and turning her thoughts to ice. A sound from above made them both look up. The dark gray wolf had returned, but this time it was doing something unexpected. It began pawing at the snow near the edge, mimicking the step Shadow had created below. Sarah watched in amazement as other members of the pack joined in, following their packmates' lead. "They're helping us," Sarah breathed in disbelief. Shadow's tail wagged slightly, the first sign of joy she'd shown since finding Sarah. The wolf pack's behavior was unprecedented. Sarah had never heard of wolves cooperatively helping a human like this. Her photographer's mind wanted to document everything, but survival took precedence over scientific observation. With renewed determination, they began moving again. The pack's efforts had created more stable handholds near the top, and Shadow seemed energized by her family's presence. Sarah forced herself to focus only on the next move, then the next, ignoring the screaming pain in her leg and the way her vision blurred at the edges. They were almost at the top when disaster struck. A chunk of ice gave way under Sarah's good foot, and she slipped. Shadow lunged to catch her weight, but the movement threw them both off balance. For one terrifying moment, Sarah felt herself falling backward, the world tilting sickeningly around her. Then something caught her jacket teeth, she realized, as she was hauled upward with surprising strength. The dark gray wolf had grabbed her, and others were there too, their bodies forming a living chain. Shadow surged upward, pushing Sarah from below, while her pack pulled from above. The next few moments were a blur of fur, snow, and desperate movement. Somehow, Sarah found herself lying on solid ground, gasping for breath in the fading light. Shadow pulled herself up last, immediately pressing against Sarah's side to share warmth. The rest of the pack surrounded them, creating a barrier against the wind with their bodies. Sarah lay there, trembling with exhaustion and cold, as the reality of what had just happened washed over her. An entire wolf pack had just worked together to save a life. It defied everything she thought she knew about wolf behavior, about the boundaries between wild and human. The dark gray wolf, Shadow's second in command, Sarah guessed, approached cautiously. It touched noses with Shadow before turning its attention to Sarah. She remained perfectly still as the wolf sniffed her face, then her injured leg. After a moment, it lay down on her other side, adding its warmth to Shadow's. One by one, the other wolves settled around them, forming a living shelter against the growing darkness. Sarah found herself at the center of a wolf pack, surrounded by the very creatures she had spent years trying to photograph from a distance. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had never felt closer to understanding wolves than in this moment, when she couldn't reach for her camera. As night fell and the temperature plummeted further, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time she opened her eyes, she saw Shadow watching over her, those amber eyes glowing in the darkness. The wolf pack's presence was like a cocoon of warmth and safety, their steady breathing a lullaby in the frozen wilderness. But even through her haze of exhaustion and pain, Sarah knew they couldn't stay here. She needed medical attention, and soon. Shadow seemed to sense this too. Her behavior became more alert, more purposeful. As Sarah slipped into unconsciousness again, she felt, rather than saw, Shadow rise to her feet. Something was about to change. She just hoped she had the strength left to face it. Sarah woke to movement and a sense of urgency in the air. The wolf pack was stirring, responding to some signal she couldn't perceive. Shadow stood at attention, her posture rigid as she scanned the horizon. The first light of dawn painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, but the beauty was lost on Sarah as another wave of pain racked her body. The cold had become an entity unto itself, seeping into every fiber of her being. Her injured leg was an agonizing weight, and the rest of her body felt like it was made of glass, ready to shatter at the slightest movement. But there was something else too, a distant sound that seemed to catch Shadow's attention. The wolf's ears swiveled forward, and her tail raised slightly. She turned to Sarah, nosing her face with unusual gentleness before letting out a series of short, sharp barks. The rest of the pack responded immediately, forming a tight circle around Sarah. Their body heat helped, but she could sense their restlessness. "What is it, girl?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely more than a rasp. Shadow's eyes met hers, and in them, she saw a determination that made her heart race. The wolf had a plan. She could feel it in the way the entire pack moved with synchronized purpose. The dark gray wolf, whom Sarah had mentally named Scout, took a position on her left side, while Shadow stayed on her right. Together, they began nudging her, clearly wanting her to move. The effort to sit up nearly made her black out, but the wolves supported her weight, their strong bodies becoming living crutches. "You want me to walk?" Sarah asked incredulously. The very thought seemed impossible. Her leg was useless, and her strength was all but gone. But Shadow's insistence was unmistakable. The wolf kept looking in a specific direction, then back at Sarah, her intention clear as daylight. With the wolf's help, Sarah managed to stand, though the world spun dangerously around her. The pack moved like a single organism, adjusting their positions to keep her upright. Shadow and Scout bore most of her weight, while the other wolves formed a protective circle around them, breaking the wind and clearing a path through the deep snow. They began moving slowly across the frozen landscape. Each step was agony, but Sarah forced herself to keep going, trusting Shadow's judgment. The wolf had saved her life multiple times already. If she thought this journey was necessary, Sarah would find the strength to make it. The distant sound grew clearer, a mechanical whirring that seemed out of place in the wilderness. Shadow's pace quickened slightly, and Sarah felt a surge of hope. Could it be? A rescue helicopter? Had someone finally noticed she was missing? But the sound faded again, lost in the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness. Sarah's heart sank, and her legs buckled beneath her. The wolves caught her before she hit the ground, but the pain of movement sent her into a coughing fit that left her gasping for air. Shadow pressed close, her warm breath on Sarah's face, carrying a whine of concern. The wolf's eyes seemed to say, "Don't give up, not now." Sarah thought of Emily again, of all the things left unsaid between them. She couldn't die here, not when she had so much to make right. "Okay," she managed between chattering teeth. "I'm okay." The wolves helped her up again, and they resumed their slow progress. The pack moved with incredible coordination, taking turns breaking trail and surrounding Sarah with their warmth. She had never seen anything like it. This level of cooperative behavior went beyond everything known about wolf social structures. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but its warmth barely penetrated the bitter cold. Sarah's thoughts began to fragment, memories mixing with the present moment. She saw Emily's first steps, heard her ex-husband's laugh, and felt the weight of her camera in her hands. Through it all, Shadow's steady presence anchored her to reality. The mechanical sound returned, louder this time. Shadow's ears perked up, and she adjusted their course slightly. The wolf was leading them toward something. Sarah could feel the purposefulness in her movements. The other wolves seemed more alert too, their heads turning in unison toward the noise. They crested a small rise, and Sarah's heart leapt. Below them lay a clearing, and in it, she could see the distinct shape of a search and rescue helicopter doing a sweep pattern. They were still too far away to spot her, but for the first time in days, real hope surged through her frozen body. Shadow let out a long, complex howl that was immediately echoed by the pack. The sound carried across the snow-covered landscape, powerful and demanding attention. Sarah watched in amazement as the helicopter's flight pattern altered slightly, turning toward their position. But they were still too far away, and Sarah's strength was failing fast. Her vision blurred, and she stumbled again. This time, when the wolves caught her, she couldn't find the strength to stand back up. The cold had won. Her body had nothing left to give. Shadow seemed to make a decision then. She looked at her pack, then at Sarah, and let out a series of sharp barks. The other wolves responded immediately, pressing closer to share their warmth. Then, Shadow did something extraordinary. She threw her head back and began to howl, but this wasn't like any wolf call Sarah had ever heard. The sound was haunting, almost musical in its complexity. It rose and fell in a pattern that seemed deliberately designed to catch human attention. Scout joined in, then the rest of the pack, their voices blending into a symphony that echoed off the mountains. The helicopter's course changed again, more decisively this time. They were heading straight for the source of the howling. Sarah watched through increasingly unfocused eyes as Shadow orchestrated her rescue. The wolf's voice never faltering, never giving up. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, reaching out to touch Shadow's fur one last time. The wolf turned to look at her, those amber eyes filled with an emotion that defied explanation. In that moment, Sarah understood something profound about the nature of compassion, about the artificial boundaries humans drew between themselves and the wild. The sound of the helicopter grew louder, and Sarah could see figures pointing in their direction. Shadow's plan had worked, they had found her. But as the helicopter approached, Sarah felt the wolves beginning to withdraw. Their wild instincts were taking over, urging them away from the approaching humans. Only Shadow remained, standing guard until the last possible moment. As the helicopter touched down and rescue workers rushed toward them, Sarah saw the wolf back away, her form magnificent against the snow. Their eyes met one final time, and in that gaze was a lifetime of understanding, of connection that transcended species. Then Shadow was gone, melting into the wilderness with her pack, leaving Sarah with a gift far more precious than survival. She had shown her what it truly meant to be wild, to be free, and most importantly, to be human. Sarah opened her eyes to the sterile white of a hospital room, the steady beep of monitors replacing the wild symphony of wolf songs. 2 weeks had passed since her rescue, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Shadow's amber gaze and felt the wolf's warm breath against her cheek. The doctors had called her survival a miracle. They couldn't explain how she had maintained her core temperature in such extreme conditions or how she had managed to travel nearly 2 miles with a severely broken leg. She hadn't told them everything. How could she explain that a wolf pack had worked together to save her life, that Shadow had shown more compassion and intelligence than many humans? She knew they would think the hypothermia had caused hallucinations, that she had imagined the entire extraordinary encounter. But the evidence was there in the news reports. The search and rescue team had captured footage of wolves howling to guide them to her location, a behavior previously undocumented in wild wolf populations. Wildlife biologists were baffled, theorizing about possible explanations for such unusual interspecies cooperation. A soft knock at the door pulled Sarah from her thoughts. Emily stood in the doorway, her golden eyes, so like Shadow's, filled with tears. "Mom," her daughter's voice wavered. "Can I come in?" Sarah's heart clenched. She hadn't seen Emily since before the accident. Her daughter had been away at college when it happened. "Of course, sweetheart, please," she held out her arms, and Emily rushed into them. "Careful with the 4 lines and monitoring equipment," Sarah said. "I was so scared," Emily sobbed into her shoulder. "When Dad called and said you were missing, I thought about our last conversation, about all the awful things I said." Sarah stroked her daughter's hair, her own tears falling freely. "I'm the one who should be sorry," Sarah whispered. "You were right about everything. I was so focused on capturing the perfect moment that I forgot to live in the ones that mattered most." She pulled back slightly, looking into her daughter's eyes. "But I had help figuring that out from an unexpected teacher." Over the next hour, Sarah told Emily everything about Shadow, about the wolf pack's extraordinary behavior, about the lesson she had learned in those desperate days. To her surprise, Emily listened without skepticism, her eyes wide with wonder. "That's why you're starting the Shadow Wolf Foundation," Emily said when Sarah finished. It wasn't a question. News of Sarah's new conservation initiative had already made headlines, though few knew the true story behind its creation. Sarah nodded, reaching for the laptop beside her bed. "Look at this," she said, pulling up the last photos recovered from her damaged camera. They were blurry, taken in the moments before the storm hit, but they clearly showed Shadow standing on the ridge, her silver coat glowing in the aurora's light. "She's beautiful," Emily breathed. "And you say she's still out there?" The tracking team confirmed it yesterday. Shadow and her pack have returned to their traditional territory, Sarah smiled, remembering the relief she felt at the news. But they've noticed something different about their behavior. The pack seems to be actively watching over lost hikers, leading them back to marked trails. They're calling it the Guardian Pack now. Emily took her mother's hand, squeezing gently. "You're going to protect them, aren't you? Make sure nobody ever tries to harm them." "That's the plan. The foundation isn't just about conservation. It's about changing how we see our relationship with the wild." Sarah's voice grew stronger with conviction. "Shadow showed me that the boundaries we create between humans and animals are artificial. There's so much we don't understand about their intelligence, their capacity for compassion." "And what about us?" Emily asked softly. "Are you really going to cut back on assignments like you promised in your text?" Sarah met her daughter's gaze steadily. "I'm not giving up photography completely. It's still part of who I am. But I'm done chasing the perfect shot at the expense of the perfect moment. From now on, my most important subject is right here." She pulled Emily close again, breathing in the familiar scent of her daughter's shampoo. Later that evening, as Emily slept in the chair beside her bed, Sarah watched the sunset paint the sky in colors that would once have had her reaching for her camera. Instead, she simply absorbed the moment, letting it fill her heart. Her leg would heal, the foundation would grow, and she would rebuild her relationship with her daughter, one present moment at a time. A week later, standing on her crutches at the edge of the hospital parking lot, Sarah heard a distant howl. Emily, who had insisted on staying to help her mother recover, grabbed her arm excitedly. "Do you think it's them?" Sarah closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. She couldn't be sure, but something in that wild voice seemed familiar, a note of strength, of wisdom, of unconditional love. "Maybe," she said, smiling. "Shadow has a way of showing up when you need her most." As they drove home, Sarah thought about the strange paths life took, how sometimes you had to get completely lost to find your way back to what mattered. She had gone into the wilderness seeking the perfect photograph, and instead, it had found something far more precious. A second chance to be the mother of the person she was meant to be. That night, Sarah dreamed of running with wolves under the aurora borealis, her body strong and whole again. Shadow ran beside her, their breaths mingling in the cold air, their hearts beating in perfect synchronization. When she woke, the dream lingered like a promise, a reminder that even in our most civilized moments, we are still connected to the wild, still capable of extraordinary acts of compassion and courage. And somewhere in the vast Alaskan wilderness, a silver wolf with amber eyes continued to watch over her territory, leading lost souls home, teaching them, as she had taught Sarah, that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in standing alone, but in learning to trust, to love, and to let others in the end.